Good afternoon, everybody. It is my pleasure to introduce Jason Earle. Jason Earle is a man on a mission, an adoring father of two boys in diapers, an incredible entrepreneur, an indoor air quality crusader. He is founder and CEO of mold inspection company 1-800 Got Mold and the creator of Got Mold Test Kit. The realization that his moldy childhood home was the underlying cause of his extreme allergies and asthma led him into the healthy home business in 2002, leaving behind a successful career on Wall Street. Over the last 2 decades, Jason has personally performed countless sick building investigations, solving many medical mysteries along the way, helping thousands of families recover their health and peace of mind. He has featured or appeared on Good Morning America, Extreme Makeover, Home Edition, The Dr. Oz Show, Entrepreneur, Wired, and more. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I think she said incredible entrepreneur. It was incurable, by the way. But thank you. Thank you. So, first of all, how's everybody doing? It's been a long few days, right? Good show? Yeah, I've been talking for 3 days, so why stop now, right? Will someone wake me up when this is over? I'm a little bit tired. So, before I get started, has anyone here had a mold problem? Yeah, I think that's probably, anybody currently have a mold problem? Yeah, okay, good. Not good that you have a mold problem, but I'm glad you're here. So this is already covered. This is who I am in summary form. I've been at this for a long time, focus on mold and indoor air quality for 2 decades now, which is kind of hard to believe. But it's been an incredible journey. People always ask me how I got into the mold business. So this is me in 1985. I was a chubby little boy, and then I lost a lot of weight when I was around 4 years old. And my parents took me to the pediatrician. I was having difficulty breathing. And he said, you shouldn't be here. You should actually take him to Children's Hospital. This looks pretty serious. So they took me to Children's Hospital, Philadelphia, where the initial diagnosis was cystic fibrosis. And that was devastating to my parents, especially my father, who lost 4 of his cousins to CF before the age of 14. So, and it's a family history kind of a thing. So 6 weeks of crying, apparently, while they waited for the second opinion. They were relieved to find out that I didn't have cystic fibrosis, evidenced by the fact that I stand here at 46 years old. But also, they were kind of dismayed to find out that I had asthma and pneumonia, which was my first big dose of antibiotics. And I was allergic to literally every single thing that they tested me for. My dad described it. He said I look like a ladybug. They put me in that papoose. I don't know if anyone has ever seen a toddler be tested for allergies, but it was like a straitjacket for a toddler. And then they drew a grid on my back and test you for the allergens. And my dad said I looked like a ladybug, just a big red swollen back with dots all over it. So it was grass, wheat, corn, eggs, dogs, cats, cotton, soybeans. And I grew up on a little hobby farm surrounded by grass, wheat, corn, eggs, dogs, cats, cotton, soybeans, all that stuff. And so I lived on inhalers until I was about 12 years old, at which point my parents split up, which was good for everybody, by the way. And all of my symptoms went away. I literally never use an inhaler again, and I am to this day not allergic to anything. So I didn't think about this again until after I had gone to work on Wall Street for about 9 years, and I decided to do something meaningful with my life. So I went on walkabout and I traveled for a bit. And while I was in Hawaii, I was reading a local newspaper, and there was a story about a gentleman who had gotten sick from the hotel where he was an employee. He blamed the hotel. He blamed the mold in the hotel. It was actually, turns out, the biggest mold problem in modern history. It was a $50 million mold problem at the Hilton Kalia Towers. And I was there at the time, just coincidentally. Maybe there are no coincidences. And so he had developed adult onset asthma, something I'd never even heard of, as well as all these other sensitivities that he had never had a problem with, foods and things like that. And it was like a deja vu moment for me, really. It was like, I suddenly went back to my childhood, and I thought, geez, I wonder if that was why I had all these problems. And so I called my father from a payphone, and I asked him, payphone's probably not there anymore, right? And I said, hey, Dad, do you think we had a mold problem at Old Trenton Road? And he just laughed at me. He goes, Jason, we had mushrooms in the basement. Of course we had mold. Why do you ask? It was that flippant, right? And that's the kind of awareness around mold that has been, fortunately, recently overcome. Right? I mean, but back then, I mean, there's just no awareness around this stuff. And I mean, my parents, they did their best, but they drove around with me in the car as an asthmatic smoking. Like that's just the '80s, and they threw you in the back of the pickup truck. There were no seatbelts or anything, so a little bit of a different world. But I immediately came back to New Jersey armed with a whole lot of curiosity, and I took a job working for a mold remediation company in sales. So I went from Wall Street to mold remediation to learn while I earned. I wanted to see what was going on. By the way, it wasn't really a mold remediation company because this is 2002. They didn't really exist. It was a basement waterproofing company that happened to be getting into mold remediation. There were no standards at the time. There were no regulations. I mean, this is the wild, wild west. So these guys were just spraying chemicals. I mean, they were literally just oftentimes leaving behind all the dead mold, bleaching things, sometimes ripping stuff out without containment, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But in essence, they were oftentimes leaving buildings sicker than when they found them. So this bothered me. And so the more I was kind of a man obsessed. In fact, what really got me interested in all of this was when I had that aha moment, I became immediately fascinated with the fact that buildings can make you sick. That to me is, and still is, a fascinating reality because it's a blind spot for so many people. It's just not something that many people think about until it really affects them. But in this particular case, I had building science manuals in my bathroom. I was just my girlfriend at the time thought I had lost my mind, but I was really fascinated with the way buildings are built the right way, the way buildings are built the wrong way, how moisture accumulates in these things, and what that turns into. And so at night, I actually was doing free inspections to help people out. And I was quickly seeing that there were these patterns. And right around that time, I also heard about a guy who trained mold sniffing dogs. And that was just about crazy enough to be brilliant. So I went down to Florida and met him. And I ended up coming back with who would become my partner for 12 years. That's Oreo. She was one of the first certified mold dogs in North America. And she and I got a lot of media attention, which was great because I suddenly was like trial by fire. I went from like, oh man, am I going to be in business, to suddenly having like all sorts of people coming out of the woodwork needing help, a lot of referrals from doctors. So we did thousands and thousands of assessments without ever having to advertise. And it was all people that had health conditions. So there was almost no real estate transactions involved. It was really people that were really concerned, mostly sick kids or homemakers, people who were spending too much time in the building. And then that turned into 1-800-GOT-MOLD, my mold inspection company, and that's still Oreo. She passed away a few years ago. But there's always been a problem for me, which is this gap between the people who could afford a mold inspection and the people that couldn't. And so ultimately, there's this, for me, I believe that, my own parents could not have afforded to hire my mold inspection company, and so that bothered me. So I went on a mission to figure out how to correct that. And I firmly believe that healthy indoor air is a basic human right. In fact, the World Health Organization, no matter what you think about them, they agree with that. And I tend to think that this is kind of funny. People are actually selling air. I mean, they'll sell anything, right? But so I decided to take this full circle and create a product that my parents could have afforded, and that's what we're here exhibiting. But that's not what I'm here to promote right now. Our mission is to empower people with the tools and knowledge they need to make better decisions about the air they breathe. That's my entire mission. It's my purpose. It's become, if I had ever 20 years ago, I would have laughed you out of the room if you told me that I was going to be the mold guy, the got mold guy. But this is just, it's taken over, and mostly to overcome the misinformation that's out there. If you go online, 99% of what you read out there is wrong. I mean, flat out wrong. And we're going to talk about mycotoxins. We're going to talk about a lot of that stuff. There's a lot of stuff, even at this conference, that's misinformation, unfortunately, that's just whispered down the lane. It's just being passed along from one person that was misinformed to the next person that was misinformed. And the internet reinforces these things. Mostly it's fear. And that's the big problem. So what are we going to talk about today? Mold 101. We're going to kind of start at the basics. I don't know what depth of knowledge people have. I mean, coming here, I wasn't sure exactly how high or low or deep or wide to go. So I kind of tried to stay down the middle. But we're going to talk about Mold 101, and then we're going to talk about what I consider to be the #1 biohack. And then we're going to talk about a new perspective on buildings that I think is kind of fun to share, and we'll see what you think about that. And then if we have time, then we'll do some Q&A. How's that sound? Cool. Okay, so common myths. This is very controversial. Not so much that you don't need to kill the mold, because you don't, and I'll explain why. But most common thing I hear is, what do you need? What do I need to do to kill the mold? Okay, and we're going to debunk these if I'm successful, and you'll let me know at the end if I'm successful. We're going to debunk these through a series of conversations. Beware the black mold, toxic mold. I want to clarify that. That doesn't mean you shouldn't worry about that, but you don't worry about it at the exclusion of the other molds. Okay, that's the big distinction, right? Mycotoxins are the source of mold illness. That is a factual misstatement. Okay, mold has lots of different compounds that can affect you adversely, and one of them in particular, which is a combination of compounds, can affect you more seriously than many mycotoxins. And then also you have to know the kind of mold you have. This is also a factual misstatement. We'll go about why that's the case. Mold is nothing to sneeze at. I couldn't help it. Sorry. I've been practicing dad jokes for a long time. Now I've got a couple little kids and I can actually use them. So I had to share it with you. So according to the Mayo Clinic, 93% or more of chronic sinusitis is mold related, which is a huge number. It affects 37 million Americans. By the way, I'm going to try not to read my slides to you because I hate it when people read slides. So these few statistics I'll go through with you. But this is mind-blowing because that's 11% of the population, right? And not many people who have that of the 11% are aware of the fact that mold is a major contributor to it, right? That's a major blind spot. EPA Berkeley Labs did a great study, and they concluded that 4.6 million of the asthma cases in America, which is about a quarter of them, are mold and dampness related. Again, another number that, I mean, everyone knows that mold's not great for asthmatics, but this is a causal link. This is a big difference, right? Aggravating a disease is a lot different than causing it. Brown University did this really interesting study, and they actually, it was very broad. It was over 6,000 participants, and they were actually trying to debunk another study from Oxford University that had found a link between mold and dampness indoors and depression. And instead, what they did was they confirmed it. And this came out. They actually, what they were concerned about, what they were confused about, was did the mold cause the depression, or was it the fact that the people were living in a moldy environment, and then they reported this, and they were disempowered, right? Somebody who's living in a moldy environment that can't fix it probably isn't feeling very happy with in their place in life, right? So the question is, which came first, the chicken or the egg? But we'll get into more about that later and how mold and dampness actually does affect you and your neurochemistry. So how does mold affect us? These are the most typical pathways: allergic, toxic, inflammatory, and then for people who have compromised immune systems, infectious. There's another myth to debunk here. People like to say, I've got mold in my body. I've got mold in my body. We all have some degree in our body, but environmental mold does not colonize human tissue easily unless you have a compromised immune system. You don't have mold growing in your gut in those cases. Stachybotrys and all these kinds of molds don't grow in an anaerobic environment. They require oxygen. Okay, so I hear this all the time. I've got mold in my body. I've got mold in my body. You may have mold metabolites in your body, which are the byproducts of their digestion and their metabolism, but unlikely, unless you have a compromised immune system, do you actually have mold growing in your body. And if you do, you better hurry up and get to the hospital because that's generally aspergillosis in the lungs, and that's a lethal infection. There's another piece here that's not listed, which is that there's a fight or flight type response that's a byproduct of the inflammatory response that tends to exacerbate symptoms, and it creates a cascade. It's basically like an adrenal thing, cortisol, and it creates this hyperreactivity that also exacerbates a sensitivity. And so these are the people that really freak out about this stuff, and the fear is the dominant thing. And these people are experiencing a byproduct of this. And by the way, many people experience all of these, all three of the top three together, right? So you can have an inflammatory response and a toxic response that triggers and the allergic response all at the same time. There's a lot here, so I'm just going to let you peruse this. The reason I show this is actually from our website. The acute symptoms, the common symptoms associated with short-term exposure, are generally acute in their duration. So you have an acute or a short-term exposure, and generally the symptoms are short-term and they're transient. They generally go away after you leave the environment. Chronic exposure generally leads to chronic symptoms. Sometimes those symptoms don't go away. That's the cold hard reality. And there are many different diseases that are closely related to chronic mold exposure that either are exacerbated or come out. Autoimmune diseases are very, very common, right? And so, you have these down here like chronic inflammatory response syndrome, which almost everyone here has heard about. But, fibromyalgia, Lyme disease, there's a big overlap on all this stuff. And so, you're taking an immune system that's already having challenges, and adding another. I look at mold. The immune system's kind of like a juggler, juggling, 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 juggling. And mold's like a guy across the room throwing baseballs at him. You know, something's going to give. And so when you've got a latent disease of some sort or a predisposed condition, that will bring those things out. And that's what happened to me. So I had all those allergies went away. Absent that chronic exposure, I'm abundantly healthy. So it's removing these chronic attacks on your immune system. Get rid of that guy throwing baseballs and let the juggling go back, right? So who's most susceptible? It's the very young and the very old. It's people with respiratory issues, environmental sensitivities. Many of you will probably know about the genetic mutation that affects about 25% of the population. And people with a compromised immune system, they're at the most risk for actually fungal infections, which is very dangerous, as I mentioned before. And then anyone who spends a concentrated amount of time indoors. And this is the big thing, you know, I mean, kids, you know, babies and puppies, you know, it's and stay-at-home moms and dads. And now, because of COVID, thankfully, guess what? We all stay at home. And so we're all in the process of experiencing, you know, a more chronic exposure to whatever our environment has in it. The numbers are staggering. This comes from one of the most reputable laboratories in this field, Lawrence Berkeley Labs. 50% of homes, 85% of commercial buildings have water damage, 45% have current leaks, and 27% of schools have roof problems. And I'm here to tell you that 27% is low. Schools are notorious. They don't report these things because Open Public Record Act, they've got all sorts of issues with that, and they're worried about buying pencils instead of buying shingles. And so it's a real problem. So you've heard this maybe from Dave also, Dave Asprey and Moldy. He says 100 million Americans. That number is basically property damage and health. It's a very nebulous number, but so I like to say 100 million, you know. What is mold? It's very simple, and it's a very complicated organism, but its intention is to be nature's great recycler and turn everything back into dirt, including your house. That's what it wants to do. And so if left to its own, if it's doing that in your yard with sticks and twigs and stuff like that, it's doing its job. If it's doing that like this, right? This is actually Stachybotrys on straw, which is, by the way, what it grows on in nature, dead grass, which is cellulose rich, which is why sheetrock, which is cellulose rich, is such a preferred mold food. And so you can see the difference in here. It looks a lot like what you'd expect it to see. But, you know, not so much. You don't want this happening, right? So as intended before, not so much here. These are the basic requirements. You got to have spores, obviously, right? These hardy reproductive capsules. You've got to have the right temperature, a food source, oxygen, and moisture. Looks a lot like the stuff we like, right? We like to have a comfortable temperature. Mold happens to like the same temperatures we do. Food source, we all need to eat, we all need to breathe, and we all need a little bit of moisture. So mold likes to hang out with us. If there's the slightest imbalance, though, then it starts to grow. So if you look at spores, this is fascinating. So a third of the planet, 30% of the Earth's biomass is fungi. 30% of the Earth's biomass. And kingdom fungi every year produces 50 megatons. That's like the biggest nuclear bomb. 50 megatons of spores, which is the equivalent of, ready for this, 500,000 blue whales. So do you think you're going to be able to avoid spores? No. Take a deep breath right now, and you will breathe in hundreds or even thousands of species without any ill effect. So you can't stop the spores. We live in a spore world. You can't even keep them out of the clean rooms at Intel or operating rooms. They're literally everywhere. They're on the face of your watch. They're on your glasses. They're everywhere. The right temperature, well, guess what? We're going to live the way we're going to live. Food source, well, we build buildings out of mold food. You know, we used to build buildings out of things that the mold didn't eat, like concrete and brick and plaster and those things. We now build buildings out of paper mache. And so mold loves to eat what we now build out of. Oxygen, obviously, we're not going to skimp on that. And moisture is the only thing in this list that you can control. And it grows anywhere. These are pictures actually from the International Space Station. This is from Mir. And this is growing on the outside, which is completely bonkers because and this is growing inside. This is from their gym locker room. And they're scared about this one because it's actually able to eat aluminum, which is historically speaking not considered to be mold friendly. It only grows on things that are one-time living, and I think it might actually be from the radiation. So they're a little worried about that getting back down here. But needless to say, fungi lives. I don't know. They don't either. They don't either. They don't either. Go look up mold on the space station. This is a real concern with NASA. Drywall. So we build buildings out of mold food. This is really fascinating. Drywall, according to this woman's study, Birgit Andersen at the Danish Technical Institute, found that sheetrock, even if you completely clean it and sanitize it, and then you get it wet and then put it in and incubate it, it will grow Stachybotrys and Chaetomium. You clean the surfaces, you remove all the mold from the surfaces, and it still grows. And she went and looked at all the manufacturers, and she found that it's already in the paper. Yeah, it's already in the paper. That's insane. So again, you can't control the spores. You can't even control the materials if you're going to build your house out of this stuff. And by the way, there are options, but not if you're going to build with a typical builder and a typical contractor, and you're not going to ask the questions. And so, there are paperless wallboards out there. And so, if you're going to do renovations, these are things to ask for and consider. Even the dumbest of the three little pigs didn't build his house out of paper, and we do it all the time. My mentor likes to say we build self-composting homes, just add water, So this is the truth. This is if you only get one thing out of this, this is it. Mold control is moisture control. Everyone always asks me, when I get my results and I have mold, what do? First, find the moisture. And then figure out where the mold's growing and to what extent. And if that's beyond your capabilities, then that's when you hire a professional, because then they will be able to do the diagnostics. But the first step is to find the moisture. And the last step is to prevent the moisture. And that's it. It's just a moisture game. And here's the other thing. This is another really big thing. This is like a public service message here. Act quickly. So if you get water damage, the clock starts ticking. And within 24 to 48 hours, again, if the right temperature is present, and you've got obviously oxygen and all that good stuff, right? You end up with potential for mold growth. 48 hours is really the threshold that most of us look at. And then 72 hours, the industry standard says that you have to treat all porous materials that are wet as if they're moldy, whether they look like it or not. So here's the catch. Water damage is free or cheap to fix. You can do it yourself. You can rip it out. You can hire a contractor who gets paid by the insurance company. Insurance will pay almost unlimited amounts to deal with water damage. As soon as you hit that 72-hour mark, it becomes mold, and now you got to hire mold remediation contractors, and guess what? Insurance companies won't pay. And so then you end up in a cash pay situation. And a lot of times people wait for the adjuster, or they wait for this, and they wait. Don't wait. You're better off ripping out wet sheetrock, as long as you don't think that there was already a leak before and there's already mold there, because ripping that out is going to make a bigger mess. But it's very important that if you have a moisture issue, you deal with it very, very quickly, okay? Oh, wrong direction. Mold is never the problem. It's just a symptom. When you talk about root cause, and everyone says mold is the root cause, I kind of think, no, dampness is the root cause. Dampness in the building is root cause. Mold is not the root cause. Mold is a symptom, and then the symptoms are the symptoms from the symptoms. It's, you know what I mean? There's a cascade that happens here. So when mold grows, it produces spores. This is a scanning electron microscope image of Aspergillus. It's actually kind of beautiful, And these things you can see are designed to break free. So the spores do what they do. They go forth and prosper, right? They're mycotoxins, which everybody likes to talk about. This is a really fascinating slide. This will tell you a lot about what you need to know about mycotoxins. Everyone's worried about mycotoxins in the air and stuff like that. I'm here to tell you that most mycotoxin exposure comes from food. People will disagree with this, but the evidence is very clear from veterinary medicine. They don't test humans on this stuff, but they do test animals on this stuff. And veterinary medicine is very clear. If you feed moldy feed to animals, they get sick and die. They have reproductive disorders. They have also modifies their DNA. It's unbelievable. So moldy food, moldy coffee. But actually, what's even more interesting is 20% of foodstuffs are contaminated by mycotoxins, according to the UN. Somebody went and looked at that and parsed out the data and said, hey, let's go research this ourselves. And took a bunch of global scientists, and they actually went to ports where all this food was being shipped out from, like the Ukraine, as we've learned, is now the breadbasket of the world, right? And what they found was that about 10% of foodstuffs are contaminated at port. At destination, 60 to 80%. Because they're being shipped across the ocean in unconditioned containers, right? And then guess what? That's our white bread. That's almost everything, right? So I always say, look in your basement for moisture. Look for moisture, but also look in your pantry. because a lot of what you're experiencing, and many people call us for assessments, and we go out and we find very small problems and not commensurate with their readings. But if you look at their diet, you can see where a lot of their exposure is coming from. What's interesting about this picture, though, is that this is actually a dish with streptococcus, right? Strep throat. Looks like strep throat, doesn't it? Put your tongue out, right? And then this is penicillium, which is, if you're Dr. Alexander Fleming, who discovered penicillin, he discovered it because he had a plate full of bacteria, and he left the dish off, left the lid off the dish, and then he went to lunch, and he came back, and he goes, oh, let me put that back on. And a spore of penicillium rather, had landed on the dish, and as it colonized, it developed this ring around it. And he thought, gosh, what is going on there? And it was the defense mechanism, or the competitive tools, it's basically chemical weapons, being oozed out into the dish so that the strep wouldn't compete for the food. This is a purely competitive tool. But if you look at this carefully, you can deduce that this is a surface issue. The mycotoxins get into the surface. If they were airborne, the whole dish would be clear. Does that make sense? If they were spewing it out, the dish would be clear. The whole dish would be completely clear. This is not the way mycotoxins work. They're oily-like substances. They tend to get on dust and spores. So if you got a really high spore count from a toxigenic mold, then you can experience a lot of mycotoxins through inhalation. But that's not usually the way it is. Now, people who live in moldy basements, like Dave Asprey, I mean, his story is he was living next to a moldy wall. He was sleeping 8 hours a day next to a moldy wall. Could he get mycotoxicosis from that? Absolutely. By the way, mycotoxicosis was discovered because horses ate moldy hay in Russia in 1930, and they ate Stachybotrys infested hay, and they bled out of their noses, and and some very intelligent scientists figured that out, cultured it, and then tested on some more horses, and all those horses died. And they said, oh, I guess we got a problem. And 1945, the term stachybotryosis, say that 10 times fast, was discovered, and ultimately, that's where we get all of this. That's the foundation for all of this knowledge. And the other compound, and this is of very great interest, is the microbial gases, which is the musty smell. The musty smell has long been considered to be just an aesthetic nuisance, but in fact, it's actually a health hazard. And we're going to talk about that more in a little bit. But VOCs come from, they're man-made VOCs, and they're just VOCs. The M is microbial. So to oversimplify it, that's kind of the universe of VOCs, the ones that are man-made and the ones that are made by microbes. And they're the byproduct of digestion. They're basically mold farts, okay? They release the enzymes onto the substrate, they release these enzymes, and then they end up releasing the digestive gases, and then they absorb the nutrients through their feelers, or what they call hyphae or mycelium, okay? This is a dead giveaway. If you've got the smell, you've got the mold, and if you're breathing it, by the way, these chemicals are a potpourri of industrial solvents. Okay, so alcohols, ketones, aldehydes. Benzene is one of the chemicals. It's a class 1 carcinogen, is routinely found coming from actively growing mold. So this is not the kind of stuff you want to breathe. So Joan Bennett is a good friend of mine. She with the mold dog, she called me once. And she said, she's a Rutgers University fungal geneticist, mycotoxin expert. And she called me when she read an article about Oreo and my mold dog. And she goes, I'd like to meet your dog, and it's okay if you come too. So I went up and met with her, and she's a big dog fan. And she began to tell me a story about how she had a house down in New Orleans that had been flooded during Katrina. She was a professor at Tulane. And then she went to Rutgers. She got a better deal up there, but she kept her house down in Louisiana. And so she, after the flooding, she decided, as a good scientist, she's going to make lemons out of lemonade. And so she went down there with a bag full of petri dishes to sample her house and to see what kind of damage there was. She walked in and she saw this. And so, needless to say, she was not exactly thrilled. All of her favorite books, including look, ironically, the Nobel autobiography from the Nobel Peace Prize. So, a typical scientist bookshelf, but without the mold, right? And this is probably kind of ironic, right? This is a giant mushroom with mold all over it. So it's one of her prized possessions. So what she did was she walked in to the house, actually. I'll back up for a second. She walked into the house with an N95 respirator, which just takes out particles, okay? And she, being a mycotoxin expert, knows that those particles are what harbor the mycotoxins, right? She walks in. Within a few minutes, she became ill. She had to leave the house, and she was sick for 2 weeks. What she noticed in that moment was that the smell was coming through. And she was flabbergasted by the fact that she'd gotten so ill. She'd scoffed on mold-related illness from mycotoxins because she knows the science. And she couldn't believe that she'd gotten so ill. So she came back to Rutgers and said, I got to figure this out. And she started looking at the research on microbial VOCs and what the musty smell is comprised of. And she found a dominant chemical, which is called 1-octantriol. And it's literally a mushroom alcohol. You can buy it online. I think you can even buy it on Amazon. And it's used as a flavoring. Right. Believe it or not, for mushroom, yeah. So she starts testing fruit flies with this compound. And she found that they stopped producing dopamine. They started flying downwards instead of to the light. They developed locomotor dysfunction. They had all sorts of neurological issues. And if you continue to expose them to them, they die. So she decided that they shouldn't be called volatile organic compounds, but rather volatoxins. And so she's gone on and written a number of papers that have since expanded upon this concept. And in fact, a lot of other scientists have since duplicated her findings. It's basically a chemical factory. I mean, mold growth indoors produces chemical weapons and industrial solvents, right? So it's not mold in your house that's a problem. Mold spores, we want diversity. We want more spores in our house. We just don't want them growing in our house because this is what happens. And what's really making us sick here is the fact that we live in chemical boxes. We have no air exchange. We're breathing this stuff. We're breathing the man-made VOCs, the microbial VOCs, the occasional mycotoxins, and all this stuff. And we're constantly rebreathing this stuff. That's what's making us sick. It's not one thing. These are cumulative things, right? The good news is that the research that Joan did with the VOCs is now turned into some diagnostics. So now instead of looking for mycotoxins in your urine or your blood, there's some new research showing that you can actually find the microbial VOCs in urine. And so that will give you a broader measure of exposure about mold exposure than this is a little bit, maybe about a year or two away. How do you know if you have a mold problem? If you see it, smell it, or feel it. You're the best mold test. You really are. Most people, I say trust your intuition, but then get the facts, right? So if you smell it, see it, or feel it, I always say if you see something, smell something, or feel something, do something. And what are your options? Well, you can either remove the whole thing, remove it, which is what remediation is, properly done. You can dilute, meaning bring in fresh air. That's only to remedy the fact that the building is no longer usable, right? So bringing in fresh air to buy yourself some time, or you can install certain equipment, or you can filter the air. But there is no solution other than source removal, okay? So filtering and diluting is just a way to buy yourself some time. In terms of what is a proper inspection, if you need to hire a mold inspector, I will tell you that the most important thing is their philosophy. Oh, by the way, I should mention this. This is really important. At the end of the talk, I actually will give you a QR code with a link to all of my notes, all of my references, all the books that I talk about, and there's just everything, every single thing that I'm talking about is there. So you don't need to worry about taking notes or any of that stuff, and it's all right there. And then you can also contact me if you have any questions. The philosophy is the most important thing. You need to make sure that you deal with someone who understands chemicals. There's no place for chemicals in remediation, which we'll talk about again in a few minutes. And I got to kind of hustle it. What do we have? About 10 minutes? Okay. Experience. You want to have someone this isn't their first rodeo. Independence. They cannot have a conflict of interest, so they can't be involved in remediation. Training is very, very important, but really experience is more important than anything. And then obviously you want to check references. The written report is key. You need to have a written report that has actually the observations, recommendations, findings, detailed scope of work, remediation plan, and a written clearance criteria. How do you know when the work is done? What is mold remediation? Remediation, the word remedy, is the root word of remediation. So that means first you fix the water. That's first. If you don't fix the water, there's no point in doing the cleanup. Careful preparation of the work area, which means containment, negative air pressure, which means a lot of plastic, unfortunately, and ventilation fans, so that the dust made in the work area stays in the work area. If that's not being done when you cut open a wall, even for a small amount, you can create a big problem. And then physically removing the mold. Physically removing it. That means removing the materials, and that also means vacuuming up and wiping down all the dust that's made during that process, and also scrubbing the air. Mold treatment is something you hear a lot. That does not exist. That's like taking an aspirin for, a brain hemorrhage. You need to actually fix the underlying issue. Treatment does not exist. Treatment is kicking the can down the road. Okay. Killing, fogging, spraying, painting is not mold remediation. This is actually going to add more chemicals to your environment. And actually, in many cases, you're adding mold food, especially paint. When you paint a surface that's moldy, mold will eat the paint. Things to avoid. Delays in dealing with water damage is obvious. We talked about that. Anyone selling fear or shortcuts, I mean, I think that's probably a pretty good rule with any contractor. Chemical sprays, fogs, or coatings, conflicts of interest, and ERMI. Anybody use ERMI? All right. Well, let's talk about ERMI. Developed by the EPA about 20 years ago. They haven't updated the technology. Meanwhile, it's genomics. Genomics has done amazing stuff, and they haven't updated it. The research, it's a research tool, not a test. And in fact, if you, and I'll show you in a second what that means, but the study was only 32 homes in Ohio that this was based on. Did you know that? 32 homes. Not exactly a great sampling. And also, like I said, it's outdated. And they also suggest that you combine a living room and a bedroom sample together into one. So how do you diagnose a building if you combine the samples? You would never take a biopsy from two parts of the body and then have it diagnosed, right? Or have it analyzed. Swiffer or dust cassette, how would you like the sample? I mean, scientific samples are collected in a standardized way. These are not suggested to be standardized. And then almost always positive. I've done hundreds of inspections behind a high ERMI and not find a problem with mold sniffing dogs and infrared cameras and every kind of thing you can imagine, and not been able to find a problem that was commensurate with the readings. And it doesn't consider the age of the house, the setting, or the location. So like an ERMI reading from a New York City apartment versus a wooded lot like where I live in Minnesota, these are going to be wildly different microbiomes, right? But ERMI doesn't take that into consideration. And the EPA even says, and they developed it, said don't use it. So I like to listen to the people who actually develop these things, and they say don't use it. It's a research tool, and it's a very outdated one. So the other big thing is don't use biocides. Biocides kill little things. They also kill big things. We happen to be fungal. We happen to be microbial, but we're closely related to fungi. So things that kill fungi actually kill human cells too. By the way, also dead mold is still allergenic and still toxigenic. So killing mold and leaving it behind just leaves behind a high allergen load and a high fungal load. And ultimately, you still need to remove it. So adding chemicals just adds another step and another cost, and then also leaves behind a chemical legacy, right? And you can't get the chemicals out. You can get the mold out, but once you put those chemicals in, you probably can't get them out. So say no to biocides, and in general, say no to biocides. The data on this is very clear. That a high microbial diversity in the home actually means lower incidence of asthma and allergies, and low diversity means higher asthma, allergies, and autoimmune disease too. There is a standard. Again, this is all on that link called the IICRC S520. It's hard to, is it glitching? Okay. So stop the killing. I suggest using flood and leak sensors. Again, there's links to the ones that I like in that link. Digital humidity gauges are very powerful so that you don't test, don't guess. You may have heard that before. It also is true with your building. Filter your air, but open your windows. You need biodiversity. Thank you. And then consider proactive testing and inspections. Don't always be reactive on these things, Prevention is clean and dry. And by the way, clean does not mean sterile. This is a super important thing. Clean means free of dirt and debris. And I always say this is the healthy home mantra. Clean and dry, right? The number one biohack. See this? Do you see the hidden tiger? I'll give you a minute. I know we're running out of time here, but I'll give you a minute. Do you see the hidden tiger? Yes. I'll spell it out for you. Go back. See the hidden tiger? See the hidden tiger? So sometimes it's just a shift in perspective that makes all the difference. David Foster Wallace gave a great talk called This is Water, and he talks about these two young fish swimming around, and they pass an older fish, and the older fish goes, "Good morning, boys. How's the water?" And like, fine. And a couple minutes later, they look at each other and they go, "What the hell's water?" And that's our air, We have 4 basic human needs: air, water, food, shelter. And the rules of 3 says you can live 3 weeks without food, 3 days without water, and 3 minutes without air. But yet, air is the thing we think about the least. But what's crazy is that we spend 90% of our time indoors. such that we're actually, Rob Dunn says we should be called Homo Indorus now instead of Homo sapiens, which I tend to agree. So you take a deep breath, and then again, you've breathed in thousands of microbes potentially, but you also do that 13 to 15 times a minute, which means about 20,000 times a day, and about 10,000 liters, by the way. Is there anything more familiar, truly? So the law of familiarity says anything you're exposed to long enough, eventually you'll take for granted. So there you go. So what are we breathing? This is the microbiome, human shedding, pet shedding, outdoor air, soil, all this stuff. This is filtering through into the house and then back out. These are chemical uptakes, so we're constantly rebreathing all this stuff. Outdoor air pollution actually gets into the house and you rebreathe outdoor air pollution, believe it or not, 4 times more. So your outdoor air pollution makes it into the house and you rebreathe that and you get exposed to outdoor air 4 times more indoors than you do outdoors. That's crazy because of the constant rebreathing of those same pollutants. And this is truly a breathtaking statistic from a book called Breathtaking, which I absolutely love. Respiratory illness in this country has exploded in the past 50 years, increasing from 163% from 65 to 98 because we started building chemical buildings basically and super tight because of energy efficiency. And mortality from 1980 to 2014 is up 30%. And that's purely because of the fact that we build tighter buildings out of chemicals, out of chemically laden products. And they're also mold friendly. So when they get moldy, we rebreathe all that stuff. It's the rebreathing that's the problem. Open your windows, right? Don't just filter the air. Also open your windows. We need the microbial diversity. Air is never neutral. It's either health giving or it's going to lead to disease. There is no neutral. You either have healthy home or an unhealthy home. It's true. First rule of peak performance: stop doing stuff that makes you weak. Mold is kryptonite. By the way, did you know that there were different colors of kryptonite? I had no idea. I had no idea. So the good news is you have more control than you think. And as biohackers, this is one of the things that's kind of fun. You actually can do a lot with your indoor air quality. You're not in control of many things in this world, but air quality in your home, you have amazing amounts of control over. Amazing amounts of control. And because you can, you should. And I would even argue because you can, you must. There's no better investment. Low cost. The cost value proposition is incredible. Your home is your health. So what's the number one biohack? It's hiding right on the tip of your nose. Hiding in plain sight. It's healthy indoor air, right? The best biohacks are free. Here's a different perspective, and I'm going to wrap this up, okay? So is this just a house? Or is this an extension of your immune system? I like to think of houses now as an extension of your immune system, an exoskeleton or an exoskin. I can go down this rabbit hole of metaphor as far as you want to go. Your buildings are actually protecting you from lots of stuff, but they're also filtering out the air. This guy's breathing through a wall assembly. It's up there with HEPA, believe it or not. But if there's stuff that's in those walls, you don't necessarily want to be breathing out of them, right? Sick buildings equals sick people. And the other part about this is that healthy buildings heal people, right? This is symbiosis. Your building is like an organism. It's a system of life supporting systems. When your building gets sick, it develops aches and pains. They manifest as moisture problems. Mold grows and sends a signal, musty smell. And that musty smell is the signal for you as the mitochondria inside of your building, right? Imagine this, just play with me on this. And so if you don't listen to that signal becomes worse and worse and worse. Again, acute turns into chronic. Chronic inflammation is its own disease. I look at mold in a building as inflammation for the building. If you don't listen to that signal, you will pay the consequences. Just like if you don't listen to the inflammation signals in your body, that becomes chronic inflammation, which is its own disease. And when a building heals, so do we, So the key takeaways, here you go. It's about more than mycotoxins, that's for sure. Your home is definitely your health. Watch the moisture, and you have a lot more control than you think. This is something that everybody, for a very low cost relative to the amount of money we spend on other things, the things that you can do to create a healthy home, especially when it comes to air quality, are all within your control. And remember, if you see something, smell something, or feel something, do something. There you go. Grab that. How are we on time? Okay. So grab that. Everybody got it? Okay, cool. And it's easy enough to remember. It's the name of the talk, gotmold.com. And my contact details, in case anybody wants to reach out, you can also grab that. So quick questions.
You talked about paint. If you have extensive mold in your house, and when you're repainting, should you be sanding the walls first to get the spores out, or because otherwise you're just covering the spores with another paint?
Well, painting moldy or wet surfaces is ill-advised. But painting in a normal environment, paint away. But use low VOC paints. That's the key. Use paints now. They're available. They're abundant and they're easy. And if you want to paint on a surface that's mold prone, you want to add zinc oxide to it.
Do ozone generators do anything for mold?
Yeah, ozone generators are ill-advised. They actually fragment spores. They oxidize, and so they can take a spore that would normally be caught in your upper respiratory and make them deeply respirable. So also they tend to cause lots of harm to human tissue. So if you can use them for odor removal, but very intermittently and without any, you have to be careful about oil paintings and gaskets on refrigerators. I mean, it eats anything that was at one time, anything that's organic. So generally speaking, ozone is not advisable except for in very short bursts for odors. Same kind of thing. Yeah, any of the zappers, any of these kinds of things, if you want to clean your air, filter it. And use carbon filters. Yeah, carbon takes out the VOCs, particles get taken out by the HEPA. So you want a air filter that has both. IQ Air makes the best ones, but they're not the best company anymore, so I'm sorry. But IQ Air Health Pro Plus is the best for mold problems. I really like Medify Air too. Sure, anywhere where there's high humidity outside, but also interestingly, in the north where I live in Minnesota, the cold, the extreme cold, causes condensation in weird places. So the humidity comes from the outside, down south, right, and then the humidity comes from the inside, up north. So Canada has major mold problems. Alaska, because they have to seal the buildings up really quick. So really, any extreme weather is really where you have problems. The places that have the most mild weather, where you can open the windows, 10 months out of the year, those places have very few mold problems because it's the difference between temperature and humidity that causes those imbalances.
If you have some water damage, let's say your toilet overflows and you've got all of a sudden just water everywhere on your walls, right? Happens to us.
Yep.
At that moment, can you do anything to prevent mold from even happening?
Clean it up really fast. Get the water out really fast. Yeah, absolutely. And that's when you see the contractors come in and use fans and dehumidifiers and sometimes heaters to circulate the air and get that. That's the key. But you got to get to it fast. You got to get to it within 24 hours. It's really important. Anybody else? Okay.
I have some expensive art that I put in storage when I had a mold problem. How do I clean it to put it back?
There are restoration companies that specialize in high value items, and so that it will cost you. That's a very specialized kind of thing.
I've had different opinions. Some people said use vinegar. Some people said just use dry. Some people said just vacuum.
You can dry vacuum it, and if you have the actual growth on it, then don't worry about it. Dry vacuum, just spores. The difference between spores and mold growth is the important thing. If mold is growing on something, that requires a whole different level of care and specialization. Spores are not the problem. It's growth that's the problem. Now, lots and lots of spores can cause a problem, just like anything else, right? The dose is the poison. And so it's a matter of how much or how little. But spores themselves are actually good for you. The more spores you breathe in, within reason, are hormetic. They're teaching your immune system to deal with them. If you reduce them completely, that's why HEPA filters all the time in your house without opening your windows actually creates too sterile of an environment. You need to have the diversity in order for your body to be ready so that when it has a natural exposure, it doesn't freak out. Does that make sense?
For new construction, what would you suggest, like low VOC paints? I just heard you.
Yes. Zinc oxide you can add to paints if you're painting on a surface that's prone to like a basement. Well, more importantly, like stucco, places where you might have algae, especially outside. Zinc oxide is a really nice way to prevent mold growth. It's also white, so it's good with white paint, but it can change the pigment for other paints. Yeah.
What do you think about diffusing essential oils in a space that's like very humid environment?
Yeah, this is a very controversial point. When I answer this, people don't like it, but they don't really do anything. They mask the odor, which is nice if you're trying to avoid that. But the fact of the matter is they also have their own VOCs. And so the idea is to reduce VOCs. Anytime you smell something that many of the, I mean, you're adding VOCs to an environment. And they don't actually do what they say in terms of like, knocking down mold spores or killing mold. They do if you put certain essential oils on mold. Yes, they'll kill them. But when you diffuse them, they don't actually do anything. Who have I not answered yet? Anyway, okay, you want to shoot? Bang.
Is mold toxic to everybody?
That's a good question. The reactiveness of mold or the reactiveness of the individual is it's an individual sensitivity thing. However, given enough time, and you see people with 5 people living in a house and only one of them is really sick, or this happens all the time. Given enough time, that person who's not experiencing symptoms will. It's just time, right? Chances are that person also spends a lot of time out of the house. That happens a lot, right? The husband or the wife, this is crazy. Why are you worried about that stuff? Well, you go off to work every day, and then when you come back, we're here all day. They don't realize, they don't connect the dots on that. Given enough time, these things are cumulative. Volatoxins, microbial VOCs, will accumulate in your body. They will. And so they are toxic. They're neurotoxic. They damage your mitochondria. They create locomotor disorders in animal experiments. In other words, Parkinsonian-like symptoms. I mean, this is bad stuff. That's just the musty odor. That's why this talk is called More Than Mycotoxins, because everyone's so focused on the mycotoxins. But if you look at the whole picture in aggregate, it's all toxic. And the man-made stuff is really bad. So if you combine that all together, it's bad news. So fresh air is the key. So yes, it is toxic to everybody. And it manifests differently in everybody and at different timelines.
Do you have a booth here, or are you offering any services or products yourself?
We have the Got Mold booth out on the terrace, where we have a do-it-yourself test kit that we just recently launched. So come visit us. I'll be there for about 45 minutes before they kick me out of here and make me start ripping that thing down. Yeah. So I think that's it, folks. Thank you very, very, very much.